Social Music Talk. Hey, welcome to another episode of Social Music Talk with Alex Cosper and producer Sam Kadura and my special guest today, a radio legend from San Diego and other places in Southern California, Dwight Arnold.
Hey, it's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for checking in.
Yeah, glad you could join us.
Another radio geezer.
From 91X.
Yeah, the 91X represented my 20s. Basically, the 10 years of my 20s were the first 10 years of 91X.
Mm-hmm. That's right. 83 is when it started, and you were there already?
Till 93, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually, I was in college radio when they actually flipped the format. I was actually on the air at Palomar College, KSM, that's where I came from, right here in North County. And I was on the air, and someone called me and went, oh my gosh, 91X is now playing the same music as you guys, because that was basically, college was doing that stuff.
Right.
And I went, oh, wow. So I listened to it and I heard it, and then I went on the air, and when I was on the air in the college station, the good way to get people to call, obviously, was to give something away. So I actually went on the air and I said, I'll give $50 to the next caller, and no one called. Like, it was like instantaneous when that format changed. Yeah. Instantaneous. Everyone was like, boom, they were there. I don't know how they found out about it so fast, but they were immediately onto that station. It was the
Was there
hugest thing.
any other station around that was playing anything like that besides K-Rock, which you can't really get in San Diego?
No. There was K-Rock. 91X was one of the first 10 for sure, maybe one of the first 5 in the country.
Yeah.
And there wasn't alternative. There wasn't even that word.
Yeah,
that didn't show
right.
up till the 90s.
It was
back then. It was
rock of the 80s.
Yes, rock of the 80s, and then cutting edge of rock was what 91X used after that. But the only way you could hear a band like Depeche Mode or Duran Duran or B-52s was in college radio. And there's 3 college stations that are still around now, and they were playing some of that. But as far as the commercial spectrum goes, it was K-Rock, or it was, then suddenly 91X.
Both 91X and K-Rock were consulted by Rick Carroll.
Well, yeah, they were consulted by Rick Carroll for the first year that 91X was on the air.
Okay.
So if you really sort of listen to the tone of the radio station the first year and then the second year, it really changed a lot when Rick left.
And then Fred Jacobs came in as a consultant, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that happened at the same time. And first, there's a big difference between K-Rock in the 80s and 91X in the 80s. Very big difference between these two stations. K-Rock was very hit-oriented.
Okay.
They had a lot of one-hit wonders, a lot of bands. The song was really great.
Soft Cell, Tainted Love.
Yeah, something like that, or Men Without Hats, or something like that.
Right.
Whereas, and that's what was the first year, because Rick was consulting, both stations were like that. But once he left, and it wasn't really Fred that had the influence, thank goodness. It was actually Max Tolkoff. Max Tolkoff,
the PD.
Mad Max, when he took over, is the one that made the station legendary. I give him all the credit in the world. He's my mentor. I love the guy. He's really ornery. But when he took over, he changed what kind of a radio station it was, from a top 40 alternative or top 40 rock of the 80s to an artist-driven station. So instead of having a playlist that would have 7 or 8 artists that you'd never heard before with their first song, you would have the 3rd Depeche Mode track or the 4th track from Billy Idol. Or he really invested in the groups, which, when you say, oh, wow, you invest in Depeche Mode. Well, when 91X changed, Depeche Mode was only played in gay clubs. That's it. There was no radio play. So it was stepping out for Max to say, I believe in Depeche Mode. We're going to go 4 songs deep into this CD or album at the time, because it was still vinyl.
Right. They didn't even have a top 40 hit till about 85. I think People was their first single.
Yeah.
Big single.
Yeah.
But you had Just Can't Get Enough was around 82, 81 maybe.
Yep.
And so were you playing those?
I was playing, the reason I actually got on the air at 91X, I got hired there, although I did an internship like everyone else. But what got me on the air first was the interview show I did in college called Backstage Pass. And the artists that I was interviewing at the college station, which were B-52s, Duran Duran, Gary Myrick, Lords of the New Church, a bunch of these bands that suddenly showed up, and they're on 91X. So when I came in, I'm like, hey, I've got, at that time, I think I had 30 interviews already, because I've been doing
And
it
these
for
were
like a year and a half.
in-studio interviews?
They were in studio, or they were done with a cassette back then.
Okay.
That was how you did it. So I had a whole bunch of different type stuff, but I had them all banked and I had them ready to go. So I was in the right place at the right time, where all these artists that were suddenly really important to 91X, and no one else really had stuff with them except for college stations, I had a whole bunch of them. I said, I'd like to come produce this for you. And there was a guy named Jim LaMarca at 91X who did, at that time, he did the Nostalgic Rock Show, which most people don't know that there was an oldie show on 91X the first like 3 or 4 years that it was alternative or whatever that format, because it was so popular. They kept it on Sunday mornings. Jim was also the production director, and he was an alumni of Palomar College KSM Radio, which is now KKSM. So that's how I got in, through him, because alumni was bringing me in. So I did a production internship. And then during that, I pitched Backstage Pass every week and bugged them until they let me get it on the air. So when it got on the air, suddenly these artists were also exploding. Like I had an interview with Duran Duran when they were breaking, and then they're on 91X, and suddenly they're like the biggest thing in town. Yeah. So a lot of it was really had to do with timing for that. So,
but 91X helped escalate the format.
Absolutely. They were a major player, like I said, in the artist-driven portion of the format, of really supporting artists, which if you talk to a lot of the artists from back then, they always remember 91X. They remember because we did the festivals with them. We did promotions with it. We used to take the guys in Depeche Mode to Club Metro after they would do concerts. Even when they played the sports arena, we took them to Club Metro because they still wanted to go, be in the club, do the DJ thing. And all that sort of stuff. So we had these relationships that started in the 80s but lasted throughout the 80s because we kept supporting these artists when they had stuff come out. And back then there was no charts.
Right.
So there was no way to say, was this band screaming up the charts or they're on 30 stations? Or there was only, 10 stations at the peak in the 80s, I guess, something like that. So there was nothing to gauge it.
I've heard it called the Dirty Dozen before, but you have to throw in a few extra little stations to make that claim.
True.
Would you say that back then in the 80s, 91X was programmed more like an album rock station in terms of the formatics?
Yeah, it was, and it was, and like I said, being an artist-driven format. You're not to get too into the weeds, but there was a certain amount of categories. I mean, back then you didn't have the computer category. You had the card system, which is like
that's how I started.
Yeah, that's and the way Max set it up is that he made sure that every quarter hour one of these core artists was in that quarter hour. One of them was going to happen. He was, and at that time it would have been Depeche Mode or Billy Idol or any other number of bands, the bands that were coming out that we were believing in at the time. Tom Petty. Tom Petty was a big part of 91X the first 2 years, believe it or not.
I could see that. You know what? I recently interviewed John Scott, who wrote the book Tom Petty and Me. He was the guy the promo guy from MCA who got Tom Petty on the air initially. So he told me that, yes, Tom Petty was marketed as a punk artist at first.
Yeah, well, they had this whole new wave, they called it, at the end of the 90s and early 80s. And Tom Petty got put in there with the Talking Heads and Blondie and Television and those other bands that were going along like that. So it sort of carried over a little bit. And another band that carried over that was a huge core artist for 91X was Roxy Music. And Roxy Music was, at that point, 10 years old.
Yeah.
But they had that kind of interesting, different kind of sound that was really what the format was about. Because back then the format was about different. Different was most important. It had to be quality.
Different from the mainstream.
Yes.
Right?
And it was all about there's a phrase of you worry that you're going to miss something if you were listening, like you didn't want to miss out on something because there was always something going on 91X, and that was the unpredictability of it. It was all quality stuff, but it could be ska and punk and then goth, and then you never knew what genre was coming your way in the next 15 minutes, so it was always exciting to listen to. Whereas the other stations, it was a pretty steady dose of whatever they were playing.
Right.
So and back then, for a very long time, 91X owned artists. There was no one
only
else in San Diego.
In town.
Yeah, so it was like for almost all of the 80s, they owned Depeche Mode. For half of the 80s, they owned U2. Now, KGB, which was the rock station, still is now, very, very popular, very powerful rock station. The nice thing about that era is KGB was, they were all about their currents. Their new music was, Motley Crue and Poison and all that. So they really had their area to sort of saturate. And so there was not a lot of direct competition. So there was only a few bands, like U2 was the one that we used to fight over.
Did 91X play Motley Crue or anything like that?
No.
Okay,
no,
so you stayed away from hair bands.
Well, I blame Halloran for this. Halloran, this is your fault. At the end of the 80s, we did play Guns N' Roses.
Okay. Welcome to the jungle.
Yeah, he'll have to explain why that happened. But
well, I could see that when they were new,
Yeah. Well, we also played a little NWA too, but that was all.
What about Metallica?
Yes.
One.
That was Inner Sandman when it first came out. But that
All
was way later
Yeah,
and all
yeah.
that was when we were the station was going through the change in music, which there were two things in the early 90s that both saved and hurt 91X, and the main affecting thing was grunge. When grunge happened, 91X had kind of played out all of the genres, and there wasn't a lot of exciting stuff going on, and suddenly, boom, here it was. The problem with that was Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains and Stone Temple Pilots would get right onto KGB2. So you had this format that was vibrant and exciting and
Quickly
amazing,
duplicated.
but it appealed to the rock audience too.
Yeah.
So even though 91X dove hardcore into that and really rode that wave, they had to share that wave. So they didn't have the same kind of unique success that they had with all the other genres, all of them in the 80s, whether it was ska or whether it was reggae or whether it was goth or whether it was dance music that was of the sort back then. So it was a different time into the 90s. It was a just much different sort of. And plus, I left in the 90s. So.
All right. Now, you went to the Flash right after that, right? Was that, or where did you go after 91X?
In 93, I left 91X for a coffee break at a classic rock station called KCLX, I believe it was called. Yeah. It was a Gannett station, another corporately owned thing. But I was only there for a short time when a couple of former employees of K-Rock said, hey, we want to do another alternative station. Are you interested in going back in the format? Which, of course, I said, when? And the brilliant thing about the Flash was, just as I had mentioned, I was talking about how 91X was consumed with grunge. That was that was the core of what they were doing. And they also became very consumed with being a current-based station where all of their music was early 90s, late 80s. Which meant that they left everything before 1988 that was pop-leaning. You didn't hear Depeche Mode anymore. You didn't hear Erasure.
Take on Me by Aha.
You didn't hear any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So the idea of the Flash, and the reason why I say it was the best idea operated by the wrong people, is they said, let's come on and let's be an alternative, but let's play 80s pop music that 91X no longer played because they were really focused on what was popular. And 91X didn't make a mistake by doing that. They were engulfing this most popular alternative genre ever. So they weren't doing something wrong. We found another way to do it. So
Was anybody else playing that 80s music by then?
Some of it was by 1993. I mean, some of Depeche Mode was on Top 40 radio by 1993, so stuff like that. But we were Flock of Seagulls and Men at Work and all that stuff was sort of because it was older, that became our library. Whereas 91X's library was grunge, new and old. I mean, they were really focused into that and very rock formatted stuff.